Well, hello everybody. It's GW here again from DQ. It's been a few months since I've seen you. Hopefully, well, I am older and hopefully a little wiser too. Lots of things going on this summer. I think the last time I talked to everybody was back in AxCon, but today we're going to talk about metrics and the importance of metrics. And we do this frequently here at DQ, and I talk about it a lot when I consult on programs all around the world because it's really the only way to know how you're doing and what the next step is to take and how to enjoy the return on investments you get from accessibility and the satisfaction, but also measure your way to it in an efficient, effective way. So, as Laura said, we've got a packed agenda today. Um, so let me jump right into that. I'll tell you first what we're going to talk about. So I do want to give a quick state of accessibility update. So A11Y, that's accessibility. It's A and then 11 letters and then Y, for those of you who may not know that. So it's shorthand that came from the Twitter days, now the X days, I suppose. So I want to talk very briefly about that just to set up why metrics are so important and how we can use them. Then we're going to talk about the importance of metrics and goals in an overall sense, and then ownership, which is something that's incredibly important to any metric or goal that you have. And then we'll talk about the metrics life cycle, audiences and their needs, and some example metrics by area need, and then the benefits of a good metric and goals program. But basically, over the years, put together a great practice to understand the best things to measure them, how to measure them, what's a good target, what do you do when you meet the targets, how do you look at that next avenue to the maturity of your program. So if you have interesting metrics you found that you don't see here, I'd love to hear about them. You can find me on LinkedIn at R. Gregory Williams or here at DQ, just GW at DQ, or ask your question here in the chat as well. So let's go ahead and talk about the quick review, the state of accessibility. Lots of things going on last year. I've been involved in accessibility over a decade now. And the difference between when I started and this point is just exponentially it's exponentially changed, both in capability and in terms of what we've been able to achieve, and leveling the playing field in terms of universal inclusivity in the digital world. First thing, let's talk about sustainable programs very quickly. So it's never been more easy to do all the things that we have today. I wish we had back when I started. We have a lot of those things because the great people here at DQ and those of us who have worked with them and work with them, very directly now, have been putting these things together for years, but it's really starting to come together. Things like artificial intelligence and machine learning is making a ton of this possible. But we're actually seeing this year companies who are capturing as much as 85% of any accessibility mistakes prior to exiting development, which is a major, major achievement. This is creating monumental savings in the practice of accessibility. We all know that the easier and the more cost efficient and less impact we're able to have with an accessibility program, the more likely companies and organizations are to build it in, and then we end up with, of course, that universal inclusiveness that we've been searching for years. Program savings, seeing some people saving in excess of 70%, 75% actually, and then maybe even 70% reduction in testing time. So these are all things you'll hear about from DQ. So stay tuned to the website. Look for some more webinars on these things, and you'll see how to make these things possible. But it's hard to ignore or refuse the need for digital accessibility when we're making it so very easy and cost effective to do. Still some legal drivers out there. Worldwide legislation is in place or evolving. In the United States, they're starting to do some rulemaking on ADA, Title II, hoping for more on Title III. Also in the United States, some of the states' jurisdictions are getting involved. California 1757, just write that down and go look at it. But it's putting in place for California, actually for the whole United States, as California likes to do, some very strong requirements for digital accessibility. And then lawsuits always growing exponentially. I think we've got more lawsuits this year by this time than we had in all of last year. So those continue to go. And then we're having some interesting fun also. I don't know if I'd call it fun, but I'll call it a lot of activity with the court system and the Supreme Court actually looking at a thing called standing, which is whether or not you have the ability to sue someone because you have some type of injury. So there's an interesting case that you'll see. I'm going to write a blog, got a blog actually underway that should come out in the next couple of weeks. That'll cover some of those cool things. Competitive advantage, another huge thing that's come forward with some research that's been done for like the American Institutes for Research, and others who are doing this, but the marketplace of the United States has exceeded $500 billion annually, well over $1 trillion around the world. But pushing businesses and the digital channels to use accessibility is really a thing that we're seeing them begin to include all customers and potential customers. And then, of course, people with disabilities have many options for their products as well, and services. So if your product and service isn't accessible or your organization isn't, there's a good chance they can go someplace else. And when they go there, there's also a good chance they're going to take their families and take their friends with them. So it's become a really big deal in terms of that market share and winning in your business to make sure that you're serving the 20% or more of people with digital accessibility needs. But governments now also just requiring it's making this a basis for doing business, which is a great thing. And then talk about the risk again real quick. So we talked about the year-over-year exponential increase. The main thing to hit here is that some of those drive-by lawsuits are becoming a little more sophisticated. They're looking for soft targets that present a lot of automated issues or lack of accessibility awareness. So make sure you've got a program in place to monitor the quality of your content and make sure that from an automated perspective, you're not having any problems. And then make sure from accessibility awareness that you've got a statement and all the good things that say that your organization is committed to digital equality. Because if you don't, we do know from studies we've done that this is a simple lawsuit settled very quickly for just a small amount of money, but it still costs most Fortune 500 organizations in excess of $350,000. So that sets the stage. I mean, just 5 minutes of what's going on in the digital accessibility world. Like I said, there's a lot more behind that. So come and find me, come and find DQ.com to check those things out. But what do we use to make sure that we're managing our risk, that we're taking the market share that we're after, that we're having an effective and efficient practice? Well, of course, we're using metrics, right? Metrics and related goals. Whenever I have a challenge put in front of me, the thing I fall back to know how I'm doing and try to figure out what the next step is going to be is math. I've loved math my whole life. But not only do I love it, it definitely makes doing business and understanding these things a lot easier. So why do metrics matter? Well, they matter because they allow you to break your accessibility journey into achievable and measurable milestones. So you may break out and say, these are the things that I'd like to do in this year, but how do you know if you've done it? Well, you can say that a task is done, but more than just completing a task, what's the actual outcome? So I can say that my task of providing automated software to my company is done. But if they're not using it, then my outcome's not going to be very good. So I have to not only complete the task of providing capabilities, right? You have obligations to your organization when you say that I want you to practice digital accessibility. Your obligation is to make sure that they have the inclination to do it, the time to do it, the education to do it, the tools and automation, because you just can't get to a sustainable position without automation. And finally, expert resources. Once teams get those 5 things, they'll do it. But who has to enable them to do that? Well, you do, the centralized accessibility team. And you use these metrics to make things actionable and relevant, and also to ensure that those goals aligned are broken again into those achievable, measurable milestones. Not did I do something task oriented, but what was the result and what happened? So how do we pick goals? Well, we want our metrics and our measurements to be what we call SMART. And by SMART, we mean they need to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So an unrealistic goal would say, I want to fix 100,000 PDFs and I'll have that done by the end of next week. Probably not, right? So realistic and timely is an important thing here. Specific means not setting a goal that's so broad you don't really understand what's happened with that goal, right? So it has to be specific to the goal that you're trying to achieve. Measurable means I just have to have some way to collect it. In many cases over the last few years, we've evolved to ways of getting this data that is much, much easier. In fact, I'm going to show you where they're built into some of the tools now, where before we had to use some things like spreadsheets and calculations and whatever it was that we used to create a dashboard with our goals and the metrics associated with it. And now those things are coming to us automatically from the tools we're using. So just remember specific, measurable, and then that achievable, realistic, and timely. Make sure you're setting those SMART goals. This, by the way, is not specific to digital accessibility. It's SMART goals in everything you do, whether you're building a house, you're building a website, or you're building a car, it really doesn't matter. So what goes with a goal or goes with a metric that is actually just as important as the metric itself? Well, this is ownership. And honestly, without ownership and accountability, you're not going to get anywhere with these metrics, because if nobody's paying attention or nobody has to respond to whether that measurement, that metric is getting better or worse, then you're probably not going to have any action taken depending on where it goes. So if it's getting better, the action may be saying, hey, look at the great things we've done. If it's getting worse, the action would be, well, I need to look at this and see why is it trending in the wrong direction. But you don't want your goals and your metrics to never be seen. Again, don't let them get on that dusty top shelf. Make sure that you've got them out in the open, that people are seeing them, that people know who to talk to. If one of your metrics, if your metric is about the health of your digital website, if one of the metrics is about the health and the percentage of time it takes to build accessibility into a software development lifecycle, I guarantee you each of these metrics and goals, someone is going to be interested in that. Someone is going to be so interested that they're going to work and drive that in the correct direction. So make sure you find that someone and make sure you get signed. Talk about who those people are. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what those people would like to see. So I'm going to go into the metrics lifecycle now. So in the metrics lifecycle, of course, we're going to create the metric and we're going to make sure that it is a smart metric, of course, as we talked about before. And then over time, some of the metrics that we collect may not necessarily fit the situation anymore. So as you evolve your program, as you evolve your digital accessibility practice, you also have to evolve the metrics that you collect. So there's some things that you may collect in the early portion of a program, or maybe the immature portion, and there are other things that you may collect once your program gets to be more efficient. So if you have a program that's primarily, just a manual testing effort with no repeatability or consistency, then testing some of the testing and recording and having metrics for some of the efficiency pieces of it, when you try to squeeze more and more efficiency out, probably isn't likely to help you, right? Because you're not in a position, you haven't built the capabilities into your organization yet to be able to achieve that. So make sure you're thinking about the life cycle. The life cycle for me always starts with, where am I? So you don't know what you don't know. And early in your program, you have to understand the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are always going to be your exposure and your content accessibility. So by exposure, I mean, what are we looking at from a return on investment perspective? So the big four there are market share. We've talked about that. Operational costs, both from building content and having people in your digital channel versus other more expensive channels. There's also risk management, of course, from litigation in some jurisdictions, not all, but in some, especially here in the United States. And then the fourth one is social justice, and just making sure that you're doing the right thing. I look at a lot of different company mottos, and when I look at the motto, it's just impossible to think of that motto not including digital accessibility, not including inclusiveness for everyone. So you look at your company models and say, these are our values, it's included there too. So knowing where you're at from those two key aspects is a very, very important place to start. So what are some of those early program metrics that you might want to think about? So visualize your digital presence as a company and by ownership. So again, you have to understand who owns which digital property, what their current status is. So they're in the midst of a major rebuild. Are they in the midst of a major economic downturn? What are the conditions that affect your business and that portion of your business? And how does that relate to your ability to be able to put accessibility in place, right? So think about those different places. You can't start everywhere at once. I mean, you could, but you're probably going to see such slow progress across the board that it's not going to make sense to you. You have to pick the right place to start, and you have to start in some places and let that success move to other parts of your organization. The other thing you have to understand is how your digital presence is being used by your customers. So if your primary channel for customers is HTML on a desktop, then perhaps that's where you want to start. If your primary digital interface with your customers is native mobile on iOS, then perhaps you want to start with native mobile on iOS with the iPhones and things there. So you have to have some usage metrics, which your company should have these. You should have things like hit counts, and you should understand what things are being used most often. Some of those things are intuitive, right? So if you've got a secured section of your website, obviously the login page is going to be used very, very often. right? In the financial sector, things like transferring money, opening accounts, paying bills, probably very important and heavily used. In the retail sector, what about your cart, your shopping experience, the comparisons, all these other things? But definitely understand how that digital presence is being used and then determine your biggest risk comparing those two. So, what do I think the accessibility is of perhaps my shopping cart, and what should I do to try to address that? And so, how do you understand the accessibility of your shopping cart? Well, you do some quick assessments, and you don't have to do a full, in-depth 3.5-hour assessment to understand how good something is, right? You can run in a few seconds something like Axe Core, which is the rule set that DQ has, and you'll see very quickly you cover about 57% of the mistakes that could be made. And so you're going to get some score within that that's going to tell you whether it's good or bad. So if you have an area that's heavily used that has a relatively low score, this is telling you something to focus on. So these are your early program metrics and what you should try to understand. Once you get those in place, you're going to begin to report them. Now, what you see here are some mock-ups of things that we used back in the day prior to having these metrics show up in some of the more advanced tooling that we have today. So these are spreadsheet, what can I generate with just the data itself? I'm going to show you a little bit that many of those metrics, including some of the ones you're seeing here now, are showing up in the tools automatically, which makes your job much, much, much easier because these things are just going to show up as a course in a matter of doing business. So thinking about maturing your program. So now my program, I've begun, I understand my exposure. I understand where to start first. I've perhaps been doing assessments and fixing things. And so I'm beginning to shore up those areas that drastically needed accessibility, whether it was from a risk perspective or whether it was from a market share perspective. But for whatever you're doing, you've made that part better. And now my program's starting to mature. So as a program starts to mature, your next thing you ask yourself is, well, where do I go from here? Well, you're going to have some leading indicators that can guide you to the progress being made and potentially the progress not being made. It's unfortunate, but just the fact of life that some things that we try go well and some things that we try don't go well. You have to have data on both of those to understand where to reinforce what you're doing and where to perhaps retool what you're doing. So those types of metrics come with visualizing your progress by organization and ownership. So we know we've started and we're starting to take some action, whatever action that is, to make things better. And so taking action would be at least beginning to get some assessments and maybe fixing things that are broken. Taking advanced action would be, well, putting accessibility earlier into the process, perhaps all the way back to concept and design. But when you visualize it this way, you'll begin to think about trends. And trends are interesting. I early in my career had a mentor who taught me performance statistics, and this had to do with network response time and when we got in distributed systems. And I thought just giving people the raw data was a cool thing to do. And he told me, no, it wasn't the right thing to do because they would interpret it all kinds of different ways and it would be wrong. So you can give people a line similar to these graphs you have here, and they can make all kinds of different assumptions about it. So don't forget that when you have a trend, you also have to say why that trend occurred. So perhaps you've been trending up in accessibility. Suddenly you have a downward trend, and then it starts to trend back up. Well, what's the explanation for that? We have to go look behind the numbers and say, well, maybe we retooled this piece of the application. Maybe we purchased third-party content that was supposed to be accessible that wasn't. Maybe I had some change in people working in my company and people and capabilities and education. So all kinds of different reasons, but make sure that you understand, where that underperforming content is and owning areas so that you can go back and then analyze behind the numbers and try to figure out what's happened there. And then determine those areas that you need to intervene in to change the narrative and improve your success. Again, the metrics you see on this page, line graph and a couple of bar graphs, but they're just showing you that, you can look at your open issue trends and understand, who's doing better, who's doing worse. In this instance, it looks like consumer banking is not doing so well because their open issues have moved from about 2.3 million maybe to 4.5 million. So we don't like there's more issues, but what happened behind that? Well, it could be that the content that they have has doubled. There's all kinds of reasons. So understand that. Understand forward and backward, and we don't want to make backward progress. right? So are our issues open? Do we have issues that are reduced? Do we have new issues that are being created? Is the contents being modified? Again, collect these metrics. You can get them from your assessments in many different ways, whether you're doing automated testing or guided testing, or even manual testing using some type of software like so DQ is a sure product, gives consistent and repeatable results and feeds into some of these metrics you're going to see. But then from the accountability perspective, know where you have to go. So who is the product owner I have to talk to? Who are the business people I have to talk to? If consumer banking wants to make sure that they're taking full advantage of the more than $500 billion, for example, in the United States, that's disposable income, this is working age adults reporting at least one disability, then they better make that trend go the other direction. Because if I'm trying to use the consumer banking product and it's not working for me, I'm going to go to the bank down the road, and I'm probably going to take again my friends and family with me. I'm going to be very displeased that I have been excluded versus being included. So this is what I've given you there is a contrast between the early program metrics and to focus on in the beginning, because you have to break this big problem down into smaller pieces. But then also as you begin to mature, the advanced things you think about, and there's really no end to the things you'll think about in tuning your accessibility practice and making it more efficient. So many, many more things to talk about. But the next thing I want to talk about with you are the audiences and the things that they need. So when I talk about audience here, what I'm really referring to are the people in your organization that impact your ability to exercise accessibility. So who are those people? Well, this could be your centralized accessibility practice or program. Some people call it a center of excellence. Some people call it just the accessibility program. Whatever you call it, you've got a central practice that's really driving this ongoing program. It could also be your content owners. So your content owners are charged with fulfilling some type of business need. They're given a bucket of money and it says, well, let's go out and spend this money. Let's get some people, build some content. And I want to make sure that I am filling the need to transfer funds between accounts. But in doing that, I have to balance everything, including non-functionals like digital accessibility, performance, security, privacy, all the other things we have to think about. And so those content owners need to be informed about how digital accessibility is playing into that. Above them, you've got senior management. So these folks are making decisions on where they're going to invest some of the company's money. Who's going to get what this year? What are we going to focus on? What's the company direction we've received from our executives or our C-suite? And how do I fulfill that vision of a larger slice of the company? And then we come on to the executives, and the executives, there's guarantee you somebody in your senior executives and C-suite wants to know, how much is this going to cost and when am I going to get done? So if you've already heard that from a senior executive in your company, you can throw a thumbs up in the webinar chat. And if you haven't heard it, I'll tell you, you're going to hear it, right? So there's metrics associated with telling them what a done state is, and we'll talk about what done means. And then we'll try to show you a little bit about what done needs there too. And I see somebody said I'm talking too fast. I apologize for that. I get excited about these things and talk pretty quickly. So I'll try to slow down a little bit so that they can keep up with me. So let's talk about the audiences and some of the things that they're going to need. So there's one thing that I think is very important, and I've called this first pass rate for a long time. For me, this is a leading indicator of how good my teams are, and even individuals sometimes, at being able to practice digital accessibility. So how can they put accessibility requirements and needs in place, and how do we tell when I need to come in and fix something? So I look at all different points in the software development lifecycle. This could also be a content management system lifecycle. I mean, whatever you use to produce the content. But the maturity and expertise of the design teams and development teams is very important, because they have to think about inclusive design as they design the product. If you don't think about that, it's going to be very hard to put that in down the road. So thinking about the design and the dev teams, the progress of automated fixes through your continuous integration, continuous development. So am I seeing a lot of defects that are created in the build cycle? Are those defects being then addressed, or do they escape out to the QA test phase? Or do they even escape the QA test phase and get out to production? Maintaining quality of that code through the QA phase. So what kind of results am I seeing there? As you begin to practice digital accessibility, you're going to see that not only will you get better at using technology to be able to test or design or develop in a faster, more accurate manner, but people are going to start to learn and they're going to start to just think about accessibility as part of the job, inclusiveness as part of it. So you're going to see fewer mistakes or defects created just because the teams are learning more. So important to measure all those things. Where can we measure all those things? So what I have here is just a pictorial representation of a software development lifecycle. And the interesting thing here is that you can measure anywhere here. So if I want to look, at the design reviews, do I conduct design reviews that take into account accessibility? If I find issues, do I resolve those issues prior to passing on? If I've put things into the backlog and they've gone into my agile development, are those things being built so that they don't generate issues from either automated testing or a guided testing perspective? When I build the code, this is when I put the code together from different engineers. Am I seeing the trend of defects go up or am I seeing it go down? When I get to shippable product and I have a deployed system, I even want to get some metrics there. So you should, as a best practice, have some type of scanning strategy that allows you to look at least the automated portion, just that 57% you can get with AxeCore, to use as a smoke test and say, do I have issues that are cropping up in production that I didn't expect for some reason? Why is that occurring? Is that probably, because I've got a leak into production? So maybe somebody's changing things and it's not going through my process, or my processes just aren't being, followed correctly. So any point in here you can measure. Some of these measurements will be things you can get from an automated fashion. Some of them you may have to manually collect the information. A lot of them over time, especially here at DQ, are being put into a central data store so that we can report on them in aggregate. So specifically for the centralized accessibility function team, what's the goal? Well, obviously to inform the program of the nature of your accessibility, your defects, your trends, your hotspots, and what can you do with those things? Well, I'd like to see my accessibility issues by severity. So if you're not using severity, you should, because not all defects are created equal, right? We can have critical and serious, which could drastically impact a person's ability to interact with the content, or we could have moderate and minor, which may not align with the specification you're using, which is probably WCAG, but probably doesn't cause a huge issue. So understand your severity. Also understand those issues by category. So why would I want to know the category? Category can form education, and training, and other things you need to provide to the teams to help them get better. If you have a lot of ARIA issues, for example, perhaps a class on ARIA or additional practice would help the team. So you need to look at this to tell you how do I and what do I give the teams to help them get better. We've talked about the trends over time already. So we want to see things improving. They won't improve constantly always because things are changing. The technology stack changes, the devices change, the guidelines change. So be ready for some ups and downs here, but understanding and having a trend and then knowing why that trend is changing are very important. Success criteria passed during the initial test. So when I first am able to do some testing, perhaps I'm doing that in the build phase, how much of that just passes? Well, if I'm able to run automated testing and I'm getting, 50% of those things passing right off the bat and very few defects, I know I have a fairly mature practice in terms of design and development, right? So important to understand these things as well. And then finally, the accessibility training completion rate. So no matter what you're using for training, if you're using something like DQ University or some other product or some other source of training, you need to know, are people taking the training? Are they taking the training that's specific to them for their role? So important to know those things as well. I do want to show you that a few of these things, so we talked about the dashboards you can mock up with the Excel data and other things, but many of these things are showing up in our DQ tools on purpose because we want to make this easier for you. So here's an example of issues by severity that's available in the product today. You remember we talked about this as one of the primary needs for the centralized accessibility team. This is issues by category. Again, we can see a little representation of, the number of issues in there, as well as some hotspots that are kind of called out. And then finally, we have the score trend, which is giving you some overall summary information as well as your trend of your accessibility health over time. So keep in mind that, when using the advanced tool sets, they're using DQ tool set, these things will come to you already built in, and we're building new things in every day. So that's our centralized accessibility team. Let's talk now about our product managers. So remember, these product owners and IT managers, they've been given the challenge, right? They've been given the bucket of money to obtain the resources they need to build a digital product to fulfill some type of company need. Again, we've talked about examples there of transferring money, opening accounts, authenticating, purchasing, using shopping cart, things like that. But so why do these people need to have metrics? Well, they've been challenged or given the opportunity or required your policy to practice digital accessibility. So they want to understand how well that's working too, because in very immature accessibility programs, we've seen that sometimes it can cost more than 15% of your overall digital investment to add accessibility. And that means if I spent $1 million on a digital product, $150,000 of that would be the cost of accessibility, which is way, way too high. And this is going to disrupt them, right? It's going to fill their backlog with things that they have to fix for accessibility, and it's going to prevent them from making functional changes and then thereby making happy customers or gaining more market share, whatever the current goal is. So they need to understand these metrics for that reason. So what are the issues that their development team are creating? What's the remaining work to be done if you got a backlog of fixes? What's your net daily defect count? Just looking day to day, what do I see within my product that needs to be fixed? And also, what are the priority of those, right? So same way we have impact, we have priority. These defects are probably going to be in Jira at this point. So we're going to see some ways to trend those things and show you, along with your impact, how do you prioritize those and triage those to decide what you're going to fix. Additionally, what's the defect life in Jira? How old are your tickets? Do you have tickets that are sitting there? Are these tickets being completed? Are they being taken care of? So basically wanting to understand through Jira or whatever type of ticket managing system you're using, are we addressing the things that are out there? The next two things, which is the defects to production interval and the defects to repair interval, basically talk about how often serious defects make it into production, which is something not only what your product owners would know, but probably your risk team as well, and your C-suites. And then finally, how long it takes to correct serious defects in production. So your policy will very likely have something to say about how long you get to fix a defect if it's found in production, if it's completely blocking people from doing something important. So all metrics that you need, all metrics that the product owners need, the centralized accessibility team will facilitate how these are dealt with. But in the end, it's really up to the product owners and the engineers and IT management to figure out how to fix these things. So we'll step up one layer on top of that, now to the senior management. So senior management's going to have many different products under them, and they're going to basically have a lot of the same needs as those product owners, but they may want to know it in a more summarized fashion. So they want to be able to make decisions on scope and budget and cost and risk management and efficiency. And so how do we enable them to do that? Well, again, we can use some of these same numbers. And in some cases, we can aggregate those or put those into a ratio that helps them better understand. So a high-level summary of the critical issues. They may not be too worried about what's in the backlog from a minor or a moderate perspective, but they're definitely worried about those things that will keep people from using the content. So they're probably going to want to understand that. Also, the accessibility score. So I can create an accessibility score by looking at the defects that exist and thinking about the impact of them and creating an algorithm that creates a score. DQ has one of those. And so you can see what the scores are and how that's created. But the score aggregates them, gives them an easier way to understand rather than just looking at it all independently and trying to draw a decision. Plus, it provides consistency across your department. They're all looking at the scores and trying to do the same thing. Your accessibility compliance over time. So are you having issues decrease? Are you seeing improvement? What are the teams doing? How is the training that you're giving them how is their proficiency with building accessibility trending one way or another as a large organization, say an IT shop for a Fortune 500 company. So that compliance over time, very important. Of course, compliance here is mentioning compliance to your internal policy. So your policy probably would say, we intend to provide accessible content using web content accessibility guidelines, 2.1, 2.x, A plus AA. So whatever that happens to be, that's the compliance I'm talking about. Also, your remediation completion time. So how long is it taking to fix the things that are going wrong? So what's a reasonably good estimate? If you're looking at the investment levels and resources, if it's taking too long to do these things, then maybe we need to look at that portion of the organization and say, we need something here. We need education. Do we need additional people? Do we need additional experience? What is it going to help with that? And then finally, the level of effort and the dollar estimated for those top critical barriers. So again, this layer, not necessarily concerned with the nuances or the details, right? They've delegated that to the product owners, but they do want to know when it comes to the serious issues, what's out there for me to deal with, and from a level of effort perspective, how much time will it take me to deal with that? Again, here I have just one example of a screenshot for this. And the screenshot, actually, this comes from DQ's reporter product, but this aggregates in many of the things we've talked about before, from a trend over time, issues by severity, issue group breakdown, but providing more of a high-level leaderboard or goal board for these senior leaders to understand. Moving one step above them, now we get to the executives. So the executives, once again, they've delegated a lot more of the detail to those senior leaders and to the product owners, but there's still some things that they want to know. For example, from a risk perspective, they want to know, do I have any CS defects that I've knowingly put in production? Hopefully not. But, if I do, I need to do something about it. So I made an exception. If we made an exception and put one in, we need to track that to fix it. Or do I have anything that I've found in the periodic scanning? So best practice, again, is to be scanning your production environment and looking for things to show up that maybe, got out there in some way that you don't understand, right? So we don't want to find anything with scanning. They also want to know that targets are being met for that periodic production scanning and those spot checks. So if my target is a certain score or target is a certain number, or maybe you say, I don't want to find any criticals in production, how am I doing with those types of things? And then finally, when thinking about the goal perspective, this is executives and probably your C-suite. So over time, they're going to want to see a downward trajectory in your year-to-year investment. So again, immature programs, perhaps spending as much as 15% of their investment on accessibility, mature programs spending 5% or less. We've got examples of programs spending 3% or 2%. So you need to be able to calculate that and show that to your C-suite executives. A downward trajectory in that SDLC time. That's what I was talking about with those percentages. Also, when the reliance on external consulting for self-sufficiency. So companies like DQ, our resources are expensive. So you can choose to outsource the whole problem to us, or you can choose to build an internal sustainable program using automation and software for consistency, which is what we recommend, right? A much more cost-effective way to handle your situation. And then also finally, a downward trajectory in the size of the centralized accessibility function. So when you begin, you may have to have a centralized team carrying the load for many areas that haven't yet built those capabilities. But over time, as those areas build the capabilities and they become proficient, the number of people that you have on your central team will shrink to a stable number that you just need to handle major change. And by major change, I mean when the devices change, or when the guidelines change, or when the legislation changes, or things like that. So good metrics and goals to think about and have. I'd recommend all of these. Again, I'd be interested in understanding anything that you've thought of that's not here. I work with hundreds of different programs across the world, and probably one of these years I'll be able to say thousands, but I'd be interested in what you're doing out there too. But some of the big key ones are the cost of accessibility, integration, reducing and contain. So expensive in the beginning, maybe a rather large hill to climb, but we should begin to see that downward trend, so that year-to-year investment of accessibility has a downward trend. And your development cycle time the same way. You should have a downward trend in how much of your development cycle is being used for accessibility needs. The reliance on the external consulting and outsourcing has a downward trend. Again, if that's in your company plan, it's in most, it may not be. But again, we found that to be the most cost-efficient way of handling accessibility. And then the size of that centralized accessibility team has a downward trend as well. So taking all that into account, so share with you the metrics, why metrics, what are some of the things we can achieve, what are the different audiences, what are the different audience needs, you can see that this practice really takes some consideration and some thinking and some designing, and that it's going to change throughout the life of your accessibility practice. But you have to have it. If you don't have it, you're going to make decisions that are uninformed. They're not going to be based on data. And you may get lucky and make the right decision, but chances are you're going to make the wrong decision, which is going to result in problems, which could be excess spend or risk leading to litigation or loss of market share, or simply not making the progress that you'd like to make. So measure your way towards that success. Define the right metrics for you. And it will be for you because companies are all a little bit different. But providing those right metrics is necessary for you to tackle your issues, make sure that you're prioritizing compliance, improve the accessibility skills of your teams, and to begin to create a sustainable practice, which, by the way, a sustainable practice for any organization of size takes several years to complete. This is not something anybody's going to do in a few months. Smaller shops, probably. Larger shops, is just not going to happen. And then measure your way onto that success. Best decisions, data-based decisions, so that you can understand and inform not only yourself and your team, but the rest of the company about what needs to be done. And then finally here, I want to go back to some of the state of accessibility things I talked about in the beginning. If you have a good or a great metrics program, what are some of the things you can expect? So here are some things that look like success to us. So when we look at programs, this speaks success to us when you reach these things. Companies or organizations that include people with disabilities in all phases of your work, this is a huge jump up. Now, I wouldn't suggest that you create a metric that says, I have to have an organization of this type, but I would say that you need to think about having the people who are going to be using this content involved in all phases. They're out there. Go out and get them. They'll help you a lot. Considering inclusive experience in your concept and design. So from the very beginning, as you think about your digital product or service, what will it be like to support people who may use it in a slightly different way than I anticipate, because they're just doing something different, whether that's using a screen reader or magnification, whatever that happens to be. Fixing up to 85% of your mistakes prior to exiting development. So I know this is possible. I've seen it. It sounds like a big goal, but you can get there with just a couple of things. You can get there with automated testing with AXCore, and then intelligent guided testing, which is AX Pro. So you should set an aggressive goal like that. And if you don't get to 85%, it's okay, but you want to get close. Consistently finishing up all your testing in about 1.5 hours. Again, traditionally we've seen 3.5 to 4 hours of testing and documentation. You can do that now in about 1.5 hours. And still have the same quality of testing that identifies the things you need to fix or validate. And then finally, reducing that initial program cost from greater than 15% down to less than 5%. But your real end statement here is going to come back, and this is to that executive that says, well, how much is it going to cost and when am I done, right? So you can say you're done when we've built an accessibility practice that is acceptable from both an impact and cost perspective. So you, Mr. or Mrs. Executive, are going to give me that. It's repeatable and consistent, and it generates the inclusive experience by default. That's when we'll be done and we'll be sustainable. So that's my presentation for today. And Laura, I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat. It's been going so fast, I haven't done a very good job. But let me jump on and let's see if there's any questions we can take in the last 15 minutes here or so.
Great. Yep, we have a ton of great questions, so feel free to keep putting those in the Q&A tool in Zoom, and I'll hop on to ask those. So first question asks, does DQ have an accessibility maturity model that organizations can use to measure success?
We do. We absolutely do. So It's just a capability and maturity model. There's nothing special about that. Those are out there for all kinds of things. Within our model is, though, the experience and practice of hundreds of different programs all around the world. So we look at 10 different aspects of digital accessibility, and we have 5 different measurements of maturity. And within that model, we're able to place people into their current maturity for that aspect. And the aspects are things like software development or life cycle, fiscal policy, procurement, all the things that you have to make changes in to create a sustainable practice. So we certainly have that. That's available. We have a strategic consulting practice. There's actually a form you can fill out to get a free strategic consultation on dq.com. So if you go out and fill that out, we can talk to you about that capability maturity model. But we certainly do have that. We call that the Digital Accessibility Transformation Index. So big name for the capability maturity model, but great question. And you should have one of those, right? That's going to go along with all these metrics. These metrics will help inform which level of maturity you place for each aspect of your program. Great question.
Thanks, DW. Okay, this is a good question. I think you addressed it a little bit, but just want to ask it in case it was missed. Have you ever worked with any organizations who track effectiveness of accessibility training efforts? And do you have any recommendations to share?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I did cover it, but we'll go back and think about it again. So effectiveness of training is incredibly important. So how do you know that your training has gotten through? And I actually look at training kind of 3 different prongs of that, right? So I use a tennis analogy, and hopefully that's okay, the sports one, but you can read a book about tennis and you maybe understand the game. You can go to a classroom with education and have somebody explain the game of tennis, but you're not going to really get good at the game of tennis until you step out on the court, try it yourself, and have an expert say, oh, well, your overhand serve needs this, that, or the other. So from those 3 perspectives, applying different learning strategies and applying those in the way the person likes to learn. Don't forget, different people like to learn in different ways, but then measuring that output by looking at something like that first pass rate. So if I give them a test application to build and they build it, how many defects do I find the very first time I test it? If I find very few defects the first time I test it, then obviously the training is getting through. If I find a ton of defects the first time I test it, then obviously I missed something. Now, things typically aren't at those extreme ends of the spectrum, but there's going to be an indicator in there that tells you, and those development statistics and the defects that are generated, how often each type is in each category, are really going to inform your training effort and what you need to do in terms of providing education, coaching, whatever it happens to be. Another good question. Very good.
Another question here. Do you have any average metrics on cost savings as a result of the reduction of defects earlier in the SDLC, which is the software development cycle?
Yes, I do. So we could spend a whole hour talking about that. I've actually developed a calculator. Well, it's an algorithm, but I've developed a calculator that shows the difference in where you address defects depending on which stage of the software development lifecycle you're in. And so basically it looks at, well, what's the escalating cost of addressing defects if they escape? And so defect containment is something I've studied my entire business life. And basically it says that as soon as I make a mistake, I recognize it and fix it. So the longer that mistake lives, the more expensive it becomes to fix. So for example, if I fix something in development, it may take 15 minutes to decide, in design, it take 15 minutes to modify the design. If I find it in development, I may have to go back to the designer. The designer may not be familiar with the situation. Maybe they moved on to something else. Now it's going to take an hour and 15 minutes. If I find it in QA, well, now I've opened a ticket. I've got triage. I've got multiple people involved in deciding. I've got to go back and fix it. The developer's moved on to something else. I have to validate that it's been fixed. I have to verify it's been fixed. So lots of activity. So maybe 10 to 15 times more expensive. And then if you find something in production, 30 to 100 times more expensive. Now, IBM did a study that said it's about 100 times more expensive. That applies, they said it was IT, but that's kind of to the manufacturing environment. So think, for example, of the United States space program. They had a space capsule. They designed it. The door opened in instead of out, right? So it seems like not a big change until they had a fire inside of the capsule and the door wouldn't open because the pressure increased. So that's an example of a 100x cost to missing that defect. So yeah, we have lots of, again, if you fill out that form or you hit me up on LinkedIn or whatever, I'd love to talk more about that, but we study that. And so the real number you look for is what's the savings, right? Well, you can save up to 75% of your dollars or level of effort hours, whatever you want to call it, by fixing something in development instead of fixing it in QA. Again, when you fix it in development, so I run a quick automated scan, I fix everything it tells me to, I move on, I'm 57% clear by the time I go to QA, and I've avoided all of the effort associated with those defects in QA, the ticketing and everything else. So 75%, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, depends on your organization. But we also customize this calculator to your organization, so we can get some information from you that can tell you just exactly what that savings is. So that's a great question. Defect containment is a big issue. Here at DQ, they call it shift left, or we call it shift left, and you probably heard that, but that means handling accessibility as early in the content development process as possible. Another great question.
Awesome. Thanks, GW.
Mhm.
Another good question here. I'm just trying to find it because I scrolled down there. We have 35 open questions, so thanks everybody for your great participation. 1 second here. So what are your recommendations for a scoring process in a smaller organization that maybe doesn't have a formal tracking system in place?
A formal tracking, smaller organization. Well, smaller, okay. This is not going to be what you expected, whoever asked the question, but smaller doesn't mean that it has to be less formal. I think, again, establishing these benchmarks and understanding and collecting the data, even if you have to collect it in a completely manual way, still isn't incredibly expensive. So I'll say, regardless if you're a small or a large organization, you still need to have a formal metrics program, even if it's just something you write bullet points down and say, here's the things I want to measure, and here's what I want them to be. You don't have to get overly fancy with these things. They just have to inform you of what your next steps would be. So smaller, again, think you're probably going to capture things from a manual perspective. You may get a lot of it through talking to people and interviewing people in your organization. So that may be the case, but if you're able to purchase software and automation and things like that, that's the better way to go. But realize, if you've got a small shop that's got 2 developers and you sell one cool product on the iPhone, maybe it's not for you. Still, things you can do should still have a formal goal and a formal program, even if it's just a couple of pieces of paper that lets the 10 people in your organization know what you're after, how you're doing, and what we can do to improve.
Awesome. This is a good question for companies that begin by working with external consulting like DQ, and they want to begin building up their internal processes. What is the good first step for them? Do they typically do so by creating a team for accessibility?
Yeah, so if you think about accessibility as a practice, you're going to have resources, people. So from resources, I'll say, time, people, and software. Let's put it in those 3 categories. And so when thinking about your resourcing plan, you may rely on a company like DQ. But if you want to do this internally, which you should, DQ advocates for this, by the way, you can use our experts only if you promise to give them back to us at some point. If you want to build that internal team, the best way to do that is to put people in concert with the experts that you have there. So the side-by-side learning, the amount and the speed of I'll call it information or knowledge sharing or knowledge transfer that can occur when you have an expert and you hire someone to be with that expert. And so do you say, do I have to hire an accessibility expert? It doesn't have to be an accessibility expert, right? It has to be somebody. So when I look at people to hire, I want to find somebody who's a lifelong continuous learner, who's inquisitive, who's open to feedback, who's wants to provide feedback, right? So in getting these people, you want to find people that are interested and have those skills, right, to be able to perform there. But then if you put them with an expert, all of our experts, at least I can say for DQ, are trained to transfer that information. So it's part of their job, not just to help you get your job done, but also to help you build the internal education and knowledge that you need. So that would be my number 1 recommendation is, get some people. We can help you create a business case for why hiring a person would be good, right? We can show some of that return on investment. When you're eventually saving 75% on a process, it's pretty simple to make the numbers come out, very good at the end from making those changes. So, but that's the best way to do it, is to put either beginner people or even people who have some knowledge there together with people whose sole job this is, and let that knowledge transfer happen. We use that over and over again in organizations. That works very, very well.
Awesome. This is an interesting question. So how do you note reasons for trends as a part of the reports? For example, there's usually an increase in reported minor issues as people become more accessibility aware.
Yeah, it's investigation. So there's no easy button for this. And a lot of times, so what I've given you today is the easy part, right? How do I create a strategy? What are some of the things that I can measure? What should I measure? What do some people want to know? Story behind the numbers is something that you or your centralized team will have to provide to the rest of the organization. How do I do that? We have to investigate. If you're doing a scan in production and you're using AxeCore and suddenly you see the numbers tick up in a certain portion of your website, you're going to have to go talk. First, you need to know who it is that owns it. But once you know who owns it, you're going to have to go talk to them and say, hey, have we had something go in? Is there some place I can check repository on, new things that have been issued to production? But you have to investigate those things, and you have to be open to the unexpected, because a lot of times the story is going to be different than you anticipate when you get into it. So having an inquisitive mind and going after that, but it's almost impossible for me to give one methodology for this to all these different organizations that we're talking to today, because you're also very different. But I will tell you that if you dig long enough, you can find those reasons, and behind the numbers, is always some really cool lever you can pull to make things better or to learn from it, and sometimes back up and go a different direction if that's required.
So, okay, we got a couple minutes left. I'll ask this last question. So do you have any recommendations for tracking cost to fix in situations where the devs could either be fixing it themselves pre-QA using a tool like Axe versus fixing tickets from QA that they've missed? So how do we credit the issues that dev fixes before anyone else sees them so that pre-QA time is valued?
Oh, yeah, that's an easy one. So use your build statistics, and this is a pretty simple one. And if you take AxeCore and integrate that in with your build, and Laura, help me, it's Axe Developer Hub, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in Axe Developer Hub, it collects statistics in a way that you can see the trends. So how many things did I fix versus how many new things did I introduce, et cetera. So you want to use those build stats to see what's been fixed, and make sure that you say, when I came out here, I was Axe clean, right? Which means that 57% has been handled. But in those build statistics, the same way you can look for test coverage, code complexity, all the other things that you look for in your build statistics, put AxeCore in there and look at accessibility the same way. And then you can see build over build over build. You'll see the trend for individuals and teams and products, and however you want to roll that up. But that's available now today just by adding AxeCore automation anywhere you have automation. Or if you don't have automation, let us know and we'll teach you how to do automation and AxeCore at the same time. So very important. I can't stress enough that automated testing. So we will probably never be able to automate everything. I'm not a believer in that, but you have to use it for the easy things, or you just don't have enough time. It becomes way too expensive. So make sure and take advantage of that.
Awesome. Thanks, TW. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. A friendly reminder, I will be sending out the recording and the slides to everyone by email, probably early next week. So keep an eye out for that. I want to thank you again, GW, for amazing content. Everybody really enjoyed it just from looking at the chat. So really, really great job. And if you do have any outstanding questions we weren't able to get to today, feel free to connect with either of us, and we'll try to do our best to answer those offline. So thank you again, everybody. Really appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.